We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear about these things.
Hello and welcome to another Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutchin, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by my Daily Record colleague Chris McCall and also by Douglas Dickey of the Scottish Daily Express. So we're keen to talk about the winter fuel payment and the way that it is unravelling in Scotland. You'll remember that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, decided to means test the payment, pretty much depriving about 900,000 older Scots of a payment they'd grown used to. This didn't go down well in Scottish Labour. It'd be fair to say that Anas Sarwar and his deputy Jackie Baillie were hugely unimpressed, and it began to really damage Scottish Labour. Their poll rating went down. They lost some local by-elections which they really should have won. And there's a real feeling in Scottish Labour that this one policy was damaging Anas Sarwar's chance of becoming the next First Minister and Labour, becoming the next party of government. But Anas Sarwar has tried to change the political weather, if I can put it like that. He has said that if Labour win the next Holyrood election, a Labour government will undo the Rachel Reeves policy and effectively move back to a kind of universal system. So his pitch is vote Scottish Labour and we will undo a UK Labour policy. Short of Rachel Reeves doing a U-turn herself, I guess my view is that this is maybe the least worst option for Anas.
I think, it's news basically that will be welcomed by most people. I think on the surface, the vast majority of pensioners are going to get their winter fuel payment back in Scotland at least. But I think the whole episode has undermined Anas Sarwar. You say that it caused anger within Scottish Labour. 37 of his MPs voted for it, just a few weeks ago. They've obviously seen their poll ratings. It looks like a hung parliament, the SNP still being the biggest party when you're still 18 months away. A few months ago, I don't think the bookies would have taken a bet on, Anas Sarwar being the next First Minister. Now, all of a sudden, it doesn't look quite so assured. I also think this is Anas trying to get in before the SNP. I have a feeling that the SNP budget in December will include this new devolved Scottish winter fuel. I think is it winter fuel payment up here or winter fuel something slightly different, but coming in from next year. So he's obviously trying to grab hold of the narrative and make sure that this is seen as Scottish Labour's baby. But ultimately, voters have been put off by it. I think maybe Labour have been a wee bit surprised at the public backlash from it, even from within their own support, because pensioners on the whole don't tend to vote for Labour, certainly in Scotland. And I think they thought maybe it was a group they could target without too much backlash from within. It's obviously not happened. I think it also puts pressure on Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. If Scottish Labour can do it, why can't they do it in England? But ultimately, it's in some ways a kind of face-saving exercise, a little bit of a political bribe. There's nothing wrong with that. I've said it before. All politics in some ways is, trying to bribe the electorate into voting for you. But it'll be real interesting to see now if the SNP do take the lead and put it in their budget, and if that has an impact on the polls as well.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's about the budget, because we revealed a couple of weeks ago John Swinney is actively considering reversing the Reeves means test, replacing it with universal benefit. If you're an Anas Sarwar, you're probably looking at that thinking, John Swinney's going to get massive political credit for doing that. Why not nip in a couple of weeks before, get the credit yourself, try and pass off what John Swinney does as copying Scottish Labour. Might be quite hard to argue that, but that's what you'll do. So, it's a bit of fancy footwork, a bit of trickery, but he's probably in a much better position than he was
No,
This
I think
time
that's
40
fair.
hours ago.
So I went to an Sarwar event yesterday, and I asked them directly, "Are you trying to steal the SNP's thunder ahead of the budget in December?" Of course, and Ask didn't answer that question directly, but of course he is. Yeah, absolutely, because they would have been in a real pickle if John Swinney and Sean Robinson, the finance secretary, had stood up in December and said, "Don't worry, guys. We're going to bring back a universal winter fuel payment here in Scotland. You know, we're going to prove that the Labour government in Westminster is the big bad beast that we've said it is all along, but you're better off under the SNP here in Scotland." And that would have been a really strong, message to take forward to the Holyrood elections in 2026. And depending on how they frame it, if they do go ahead, the Scottish Government, with this, it still will be, it'll be interesting to see who voters credit. If you're an older Scot, a pensioner, and you are genuinely worried about how you're going to pay the heating bills this winter, and if you do get this benefit coming back, you probably are going to be on the one hand like, well, why did they take it away from me in the first place? If they'd said we can't afford to pay this anymore, that's one thing. I'll have to cut my cloth to suit my means. But then suddenly there's a screeching U-turn, and I'm like, oh, actually, don't worry, it's fine. Have it after all. You maybe will be a bit confused and think, well, what are they playing at here? What's the message? Who am I supposed to trust? And the question for Labour is, in Scotland, will voters take the money and think, well, thanks, but I'm not going to give you any credit for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like two different types of critic of this. If you're an older person, there's an older person who's maybe on 12 grand a year who thinks, I'm not on a big income and yet I'm having money taken away from me. And then you maybe have folk who are a bit wealthier, but they think it was a sneaky way to do it, that they didn't say anything about it during the election. And then one of the first things they did was just target one group of people in isolation, not part of a broader narrative of X, Y, and Z have to make sacrifices as well. So, if you're an older person living anywhere in the UK, you're not going to be looking at Labour favourably, because it's just the way they did it, I think, leaves a nasty taste in the mouth, because you can make a case for it. You can make a case for means testing, trying to claw money back from wealthier pensioners, but I just feel like there's a sense that they didn't do it in an honest way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said before, no one's suggesting that the likes of Elton John and Sir Paul McCartney should be getting £300 a year,
No.
or whatever to pay their heating bills. But yeah, I mean, this wasn't even murmured about in the election. I don't even remember there being any suggestion of it whatsoever. And then it's come out, they've spoken about this £22 billion worth of pain, which again they played down during the election campaign. I still don't understand why they've done that, because ultimately they could still turn around and say, well, we're going to be facing this £22 billion black hole because of the Tories. I don't really understand why Labour were so keen to play it down, because now they've been left having to deal with that, and yet they didn't raise it before the election, so people are going to automatically blame them for it. One thing I will say though is maybe it's a wee bit trickier for the SNP, who've spent months telling us that this, is a Labour cut, and then if they come out in the budget and say, well, actually we're going to cover it, people might say, well, why didn't you've been saying that you don't have the power to cover it, you've been saying this is this lies at Westminster, why didn't the SNP just do that in the first place? They would obviously say it's not their job to mitigate decisions made at Westminster. I would argue that's the whole point of the Scottish Parliament. The whole point of the Scottish Parliament is that we can take slightly different decisions up here.
Yeah, I've never liked the mitigate word or argument. It's like, if we want to make our own decisions, if we want to reverse it, then we can do that within our own budget.
But I think ultimately Labour have gambled. They're gambling on two things. Number one, they're gambling on targeting pensioners and farmers, two groups who aren't exactly known as great lovers of
Jeremy Clarkson's both, I think.
Well, yeah, he is these days.
He's a farmer.
But they're targeting them because they think this isn't our natural support base, and on the other hand, they're they think that maybe come the next Westminster election, this might be forgotten about. Who's to say Rachel Reeves won't have something up her cuff in the next budget that all of a sudden we can bring back? It will still be means tested, but we're going to expand it a bit more. that might not come early enough for Anis Sarwar. That doesn't do Anis Sarwar any good. But I think ultimately, Keir Starmer's taking a much longer term view, and he probably thinks the Holyrood elections are a bit of an annoyance, to be honest, at the moment, and the impact it has in Scotland, I doubt will have entered his thinking.
See, if you're a Scottish Labour MP and you've taken pelters over this policy over the last few months, and you were whipped to vote for it as well, and I understand the Scottish Labour leadership even encouraged Scottish Labour MPs to vote for the cut, and then the MSPs and their leadership turn around and say, actually, we're going to scrap it at the next Holyrood election. Just trying to think what they would feel about it. It's almost like they're the whipping boys. They're the ones who've been sort of thrown into the fire, and then an ass, and I don't blame him for this, nips in and sort of changes the position.
It's fair to say that Scottish Labour MPs will not be terribly impressed with the events of this week. For some of them, it will be a rude awakening for how parliamentary politics works, because a lot of them, of course, are new MPs. They're new to the Commons, so they're kind of new to this. I don't want to call it a game, but how parties work and interact with policies, especially when policies prove to be extremely unpopular with the public and you have to do another screeching U-turn. So it's fair to say there might be a fair degree of grumbling going on in the tea rooms in the Commons and on the trains back up to Glasgow and Edinburgh from Westminster at the weekend. But ultimately, I'm sure most of them will realise this is something Scottish Labour has to do. Because I do think it shouldn't be underestimated how important the party, the UK party Labour, views the 2026 Holyrood election, just in the sense that they want to be seen as a party of the UK. It was very important for them to win in Scotland, to get multiple MPs up here. But also, if Keir Starmer and Anas Sarwar can take Labour to victory at Holyrood, and it would be the first time since 2003. Let's remember that it's been a long time since Labour has won at Holyrood. If they could do that, that would be a real midterm boost for Labour, I think. But as you say, it's 18 months away. There's a lot of water to flow under the bridge. Right now, there's a lot of focus on this policy, the winter fuel payment. Now, I'm not downplaying how important the winter fuel payment is to people, but by the time of the 2026 election, there'll be a whole other range of things to talk about. And Anas and Scottish Labour are obviously gambling. They're hoping that they'll take, no pun intended, some of the heat out of, this debate at the minute. And that by the time that May 2026 comes around, we'll be in a sunny springtime. People aren't so worried about their fuel bills. There'll be other issues to play. And number one of those, of course, will be 20 years of the SNP in government. That's a long, long time for any party. So plenty to chew over.
Yeah, I spoke to a Labour cabinet minister in the summer who said that from a Labour perspective, their top priority is winning the Holyrood election. So, even people in London, they see it that way. But if you look at events of the last few months, there's no doubt that UK Labour at government level and Scottish Labour are just out of sync, because Anas wants the first 18 months of Labour government to be about good news, delivering what Labour government can do for the people of Scotland, whereas Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer want to front load the pain. They want to bring forward the bad news and then break out the good news in the latter half of this parliament. So, although UK Labour are saying that Scotland is so important, it does seem like Downing Street and Scottish Labour are at cross purposes.
I guess this is one of the pitfalls of effectively having two parties which are within one party.
Yeah.
It's a very unique situation we've got here. Scottish Labour, I've actually never been a massive fan of it. I think ultimately, if you're a UK wide party, you should have a focus on UK wide issues, and those issues should be able to marry up. But obviously over the past few years, the SNP have been able to shift the narrative. They put a kilt on everything, and Labour have kind of followed that. The Tories have done it as well. It's not just a Labour problem. I think the Scottish Tories have found themselves out of sync with the UK party at times, and now you're seeing it with Labour. But I think ultimately, we still have a wee bit. As Chris says, there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge. But the Holyrood elections aren't that far away, and I think this is going to, this is going to play badly on the doors for them, even if he does put this forward. I mean, you could argue, to take it from a purely scientific view, Scotland is colder than England, so perhaps it's right that, you know, Scottish pensioners get that, you know, a bit extra to help with their fuel payments. Maybe that's how we should kind of sell it to the people. But
I think Anas's problem is that, you know, what if Scots use the Holyrood election as a sort of midterm election on the Westminster government to send a signal to Keir Starmer that, you know, he's essentially betrayed them or he hasn't delivered on the change. That's the sort of problem that he's got, that they're not voting on who they want to be in Edinburgh, but they're delivering a verdict on how it's going in London.
Well, that's in some ways the election in Scotland was a verdict on the SNP in Edinburgh. So yeah, I mean, that's a real kind of danger for them. You see it all over the world, especially in America. Those kind of midterms are the opportunity to put your, you know, to express your dissatisfaction with the kind of wider government. And you know, the polls suggest that is going to happen. It suggests the SNP are going to be the biggest party, well short of a majority. We're heading for a hung parliament, and you know, and I think Anas Sarwar's hopes of being First Minister are hanging by a thread at the moment.
All right, let's move on to the other story that's been dominating, Stephen Flynn and his future. So the SNP Westminster leader, we know, announced last week that he wanted to double job, basically get elected to Holyrood in 2026 while holding on to his Westminster gig as well. I think it'd be fair to say that Stephen Flynn's probably undergone the most difficult week of his political career. The backlash within the SNP has been something to behold, because he is trying to elbow a female MSP, Audrey Nicholl, out of the way. He's also been accused of undermining the SNP's anti-double jobbing position, which they had in the run-up to the last Holyrood election. And he's also upset the equilibrium that John Swinney's brought to the SNP since he took over, because John Swinney has presided over a fairly united group. Flynn's come in like a bull in a china shop, you know, smashed everything to pieces. And, you know, now what we have is a vote in Holyrood before Christmas that could actually ban double jobbing, that could stop his plan in its tracks. Do you think Flynn's got lessons to learn from the way he's handled this whole episode?
I think that's to put it mildly. Stephen Flynn, as he said in a BBC interview at the weekend, he's a very ambitious individual. He says he's ambitious for, you know, Scotland as an SNP politician. He would say that, but he's not hiding the fact that he views himself as the next leader of the party. So whenever John Swinney chooses to ride off into the sunset, Stephen Flynn will be the anointed successor, and you'll be in Holyrood in his mind, you know, ready to step in if and when that happens. But I mean, given the events of the last week, as you just described there so neatly, Paul, I mean, if you were a bookmaker, his odds of becoming leader have lengthened considerably. Because the few strands to this plan from Stephen that I did find eyebrow raising, particularly when I read the Preston Journal last week, where he chose to give the story on Tuesday. He didn't need to say, I specifically want to win in this seat. So he said he's the MP for Aberdeen South. He says he now wants to be the MSP for Aberdeen South as well. The massive problem there being there is already a sitting SNP MSP there, and Audrey Nicholl. The fact that he singled out this seat and said, that's what I'm going to take, it's really, really bold, kind of aggressive in a way. And, Audrey Nicholl, former serving police officer, very experienced in public service. She's very thick-skinned. I'm sure, she will be more than capable of putting up a fight against Stephen Flynn if that's how she wants to pursue it. But you must be thinking, if you're in the local party in Aberdeen, going, did you really have to do this, Stephen? Could we not, had a chat privately and found a way around this? If you're really that keen to go to Holyrood, fine. But let's go about this in a more quiet and subtle manner than the plan you've now unleashed on us.
And fast forward to the actual selection. Say he goes head-to-head with Audrey Nicholl. She's going to run a campaign saying, I will be a full-time MSP. Obviously a dig at Flynn. And his selling, isn't it? Double jobbing, this idea of holding on to an MSP and an MP job at the same time, that's not exactly a great selling point in a selection campaign.
No. However, I think two things are probably definitely going to happen, and a third is likely to happen. I think Stephen Flynn's name will be in the ballot at Holyrood in 2026, and I think he will win the seat probably, and he'll probably go on and be SNP leader at some point in the future. I think he's made a real mess of this. Chris, you referenced his Sunday show interview, and Sunday it was toe-curlingly bad. I thought it was awful. He was all over the place, which isn't like him, because we've seen it. At Westminster, he can be a very effective operator. But I would be surprised if he's done this without some sort of assurances, or unless he was sure that he can get his name on the ballot. And the word from up in Aberdeen seems to be that the members will back him. At the end of the day, he's got quite a high profile. Given his time at Westminster, obviously doesn't get PMQs anymore as a third party, but he's managed to lead the news agenda UK-wide at times, which is something the SNP hardly ever do. He's obviously an ambitious guy, and I think it's not a great look for him. The worst thing is actually the hypocrisy of him. He's had a go at Douglas Ross. He had a go at a councillor way back when a councillor was going to stay on council-wise, and he said, no, you can't double job. It's a terrible look for him. But ultimately, I think SNP members up there like him, and I think he will be on the ballot. Ultimately, whether he's allowed to take his place at Holyrood if this new rule gets voted through is another question. But I'm sure you're going to kind of come to that.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'll come to the vote. I mean, Flynn, you're right. He is an effective operator, and he's made himself felt at Westminster, and he's had some pretty decent wins down there. But I look at the last week, and I think about how Humza Yousaf ditched the Greens. So people privately in the SNP will say the politics about were correct, but Humza just lost sight of the human side of politics. And I think the same criticism can be made of Stephen Flynn, that the way he's kind of gone about this, he should have tried to bring people on board, and he's lost sight of the human side of internal SNP politics. And that's a problem. If you really annoy people and you come across as arrogant, then it's going to have a bad outcome for you. So even though I think he's still the favourite to get the selection, I think he's got his work cut out. And of course, we've got this vote now as well before Christmas. Labour and the Greens are going to be voting for the Graham Simpson amendment. I'm not actually sure that the Conservatives are going to be voting for it, which is interesting given that Graham Simpson's a Tory MSP. The Lib Dems are considering it. I think John Swinney will feel under pressure, given that they had an anti-double jobbing rule in place for the 2021 election. I mean, this is a real problem for Flynn. If the momentum for this amendment keeps building, other parties lend their weight to it, and suddenly it looks like Holyrood is going to essentially block MPs from serving as MSPs for a significant period of time, because that will mean that if he does get elected in 2026, he's going to have to resign his seat at Westminster within 8 days, triggering a damaging by-election for the SNP. So, this vote is an interesting one. I don't know how it's going to pan out, but it's a real spanner in the works for him.
Absolutely. And you're talking there about the human side of politics. And, if you annoy people, they tend to remember it, sticks in your memory, because we couldn't not mention the briefing operation that's been going on in recent days. You talked about how John Swinney came in as leader in spring, and, pretty bad circumstances, really, what happened to Humza Yousaf. John Swinney, very, very experienced operator, of course, but he's kind of, kept the show on the road. They've managed to sort of been relatively plain sailing, given everything that's been thrown at them. A terrible general election result in July. All that considered, the SNP now ahead in the polls and got a real fist at being the largest party after the 2026 election. And now we have this incredible briefing war that's been going on across newspapers and social media in recent days, all caused by Stephen Flynn. Now, I'm not saying that all this briefing is coming from him directly. but allies of him, supporters of him, have been pretty damn critical of the quality of the MSP group that the SNP have, openly calling them rubbish and saying they've achieved nothing. Some of them, not all of them. Now, I'm not saying that, but some of Stephen Flynn's people are.
Yeah, I think that if he'd sat down and mapped it out, I think any strategy would have been better than the strategy he's gone for. I think he's tried to bounce people into it. He's tried to kind of impose his will, whereas just maybe a bit of subtlety and sensitivity would have been in order. Maybe he's still the favourite to be next SNP leader. I think maybe Kate Forbes said last week, Jenny Gilruth may also be a candidate. But I think that stock in Stephen Flynn has fallen. I think his share price has gone down over the last week. And, once your reputation takes a battering like that, it's hard to kind of pick it up.
Yeah, we were actually discussing this earlier at the Express, and it's almost as if he's decided that things are too boring right now within the SNP. We've had years of Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf, and it was always like crisis after crisis. And all of a sudden, John Swinney comes in, a very boring but reasonably competent man. I was thinking, if Spitting Image were still about, he would be the grey John Major. And he's come in, he's kind of steadied the ship, and Stephen Flynn's obviously thought, well, hold on a second, we can't have that, bang. But ultimately, he's like an old school politician, Stephen, and I think he sees something and he's going to go for it. I've got to say, just on this vote, I actually think it's a really bad idea. I don't think it's been fully thought through. It seems that Graham Simpson's wanting to make some cheap political capital in
always my favourite
short term. Well, in the kind of short term, it's good to bash Stephen Flynn with. It's good to bash the SNP with.
Well, to be fair though, he did have it before the Flynn row. So I don't think he, certainly at stage 2, it wasn't motivated by Flynn. But you're right, at stage 3, given all that's happened, yeah.
But for me, the only people who should decide who an MSP is are the voters. Now, parties can decide who their candidate should be, but ultimately it should be up to voters to decide. If someone wants to be an MP and an MSP and they're on the ballot paper and they make that clear, it should be for the constituency to make that decision. I personally wouldn't vote for someone who's going to double job, because I think you've got to be focused on one or the other. But that's a choice that voters should be given. It shouldn't be up to MSPs to decide who should and shouldn't be able to stand. Obviously, parties can, but and it could backfire on the Tories, because we could have another Douglas Ross situation. It's not so long ago that Douglas Ross, I'm sure you guys will pipe in, was triple jobbing, never mind double jobbing, but you just don't know what's around the corner, and I think it could be counterproductive. I think one of the Lib Dems this weekend had said she would.
I think he was quadruple jobbing, actually.
Quadruple jobbing,
MSP, MP, referee, and Scottish Party leader. Quadruple jobbing.
Well, that's the thing. One of the reasons I sometimes would be reluctant to vote for someone I even thought was going to be a government minister, because you want someone focused on kind of constituency issues, and I think some of Stephen Flynn's supporters have made that point. The MD who's a government minister is effectively double jobbing. But I don't like it at all. I hope it doesn't pass, and I hope it's left to the voters to make the decision.
I can kind of see your point there. I think that there probably is room for flexibility in how this system works. Adam Tompkins, former Conservative MSP and Glasgow Uni law academic, he made a point that he was holding down 2 jobs when he was at Holyrood. He was a constituency MSP and he was also continuing to do academic work, and he credited having an extremely good constituency office team around him, staff members around him that allowed him to do that. I do think, there are people that can do it. It's a lot of work. I don't think all politicians are capable of it. I think in the main, it would be good for voters and politicians if they stuck to one task. But you look at the House of Commons in Westminster, or as long as there's been elected MPs there, we've had particularly lawyers continue to work on outside jobs. But double jobbing is a slightly different thing, because you're effectively wearing 2 hats at the same time for the same constituency. And the other example, of course, we have Cardiff and Belfast. The devolved governments there have come in and drawn a clear line saying you have to stick to this one government. You can't go down to London as well. because in Northern Ireland, particularly the late Reverend Ian Paisley, he was an MP, he was an MEP, he was an assembly member. If there was an elected role, he would take that, but no longer. So I can see it from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to wrap it up, I think it's probably the big story between now and Christmas is obviously the budget, but I think a close second, well, not a close second, but I think in second place would be the double jobbing vote, which is probably going to take within weeks. So watch the space. Thanks again to Chris and to Dougie. I hope you enjoyed the latest episode of Planet Holyrood. You can watch it on our YouTube channel, and I hope you join us again next week.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
I was furious to hear about these things.